Happy Easter. It's a good day to be here. I was thinking about, as we're going through Luke's gospel, the way that Luke tells the resurrection story. All four gospels kind of give us a different view. I think it's helpful to think in these terms. You remember when the kids were caught in the cave in the Philippines? Remember I think it was last year when this happened? And the waters were rising because of the monsoon season, and they were stuck and couldn't get out. Well, I remember reading 3 different essay-length articles, newspaper articles about it. And one of them, I think, was the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times. And each of them said what happened, but they told them from a slightly different perspective. So one of the articles, it was totally through the parents' eyes of those children and how they experienced that couple of weeks. And then another was through the Navy SEALs, who actually went in and were the divers that helped to get them out. And then another one was more just kind of everything that happened. Now, all of them told the same story, and if you read each article, you're like, that's true. But they're slightly different angles, and that's what the Gospels do with the story of Easter. All 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, cover the story of Easter, but they give us a slightly different perspective. What Luke is emphasizing, as we're going to look at today, is this idea of expectations. I ran across a phrase about expectations that I had not heard before this week, and I thought, wow, expectations are premeditated resentments. Let that sink in for a moment. There was a psychologist at the Penn State University, and he was talking about the psychology of expectations, and so he got this phrase. And he doesn't know where it came from, but the way he ran across it is it was being used in Al-Anon meetings. You can understand, right? If you have somebody who's a close relative or a close friend who has an addiction, and you have expectations that they're not going to fall back, and then they fall back, it breeds resentment. But it's not just true in that context. I think it's true in a lot of contexts. I also happened to read this week, I think this is why these things were coming together, a column in the New York Times by a columnist I read a lot, and he said that the culture is in the mess it's in here in American society because we believe lies. Or you might say we have bad expectations. This is the first one he says, that career success is fulfilling. So he says, we believe as a culture that we're going to find fulfillment. We expect to find fulfillment through career success. And yet people who get there realize they're not fulfilled. He gives the example of his first book became the New York Times #1 bestseller and held that position for a little while. And he remembers his publisher calling him and saying, hey, you're #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And he said nothing had changed. It was like his realization that success isn't fulfilling. I've seen this with athletes. There was a professional golfer who won a major championship. His whole career working towards that major championship. And when he was interviewed about a year later, he said he won that major championship, and on Monday morning he woke up and everything was the same. He thought that was going to fulfill him, and it didn't. I was talking with a baseball player. And you know it's not a Dodger because he had won the World Series. And he won 2 World Series. And he had that same expectation that after the World Series, life was going to be great, that he was going to be fulfilled. And he realized he wasn't. It actually sent him into a depression as he retired after the second one. We think success is going to be fulfilling, and we reach it, and we realize it isn't. That's one expectation. Another expectation he talked about is that we can make ourselves happy. We live in an individualistic culture. We think, I can make me happy, and that becomes our pursuit, and we keep chasing happiness. If I can lose 15 pounds, then I'll be happy. If I could do this, then I'll be happy, to the exclusion of other people in our lives. And he said what we find, there was a study done, people on their deathbed. And as they did this study, they found that the happiest people on their deathbed, which kind of sounds funny, but the happiest people who look back with the happiest life were the ones who were tied down in relationships. They didn't try it doing themselves. They found it in relationship with other people. Life is an individual journey. We're all about freedom. We're all about experiences, and he who has the most experience wins the game. And yet you go out on this journey and you experience all these experiences, and it's never enough because you watch social media and you look at things that other people are experiencing, and you realize this individual journey is not ultimately going to lead me to the destination I want to get to. How about this one? He didn't say this, but I say this: that God will help me to be successful. We may not say that out loud. We may not actually articulate that God is there to make me successful, but I think a lot of us expect it. We expect that God will make us successful. We expect that God will help us accomplish the goals we set. We expect that when we come to Christ, life is going to be good and paths are going to be cleared for me to succeed. And then it doesn't happen, and you're disappointed or even resentful. It's a really good way to look at how Luke tells the Easter story, because everybody had expectations. They had expectations about what the Messiah, about what Christ, about what God's servant would do and what he would accomplish. And for some people, when Jesus dies on the cross, their expectations lead to disappointment. There's other people that their expectations lead to resentment. Somewhere on that scale, if our expectations, we're expecting God, we're going to be disappointed and maybe even resentful. So open your Bibles to Luke chapter 24. Let's take a look at expectations and then see the conclusion of our passage. What might be a better way of going through life than expecting God? Luke chapter 24, if you want to grab a Bible from under your chairs, we'll be on page 884. On Friday, Jesus was crucified. Joseph of Arimathea, who was a wealthy man, he had a tomb, which the wealthy had. He volunteers his tomb to take Jesus' body, and he buries it. And on Sunday morning, the two Marys and Salome head to the temple, or head to the tomb in order to anoint his body with oils and spices, which was according to custom. And when they get there, they're surprised, to say the least. Chapter 24, verse 1, but on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And we read the other Gospels, and they actually use angels. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise?" And they remembered his words. Jesus hadn't been quiet about what he was going to do. But their expectations were such that they didn't hear what Jesus was saying. Their expectations were that the Messiah, the Christ, the servant of the Lord, would come and he would bring God's kingdom by defeating the kingdom in the land, the Roman Empire. So he's going to come, he's going to defeat the Roman Empire and then establish God's kingdom. That's what they were looking for. And so they didn't hear it even when Jesus said it. 3 times in Luke's gospel, Jesus says something like this. Then Jesus strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised." But they were surprised. Why? Because their expectations had blinded them. But while they were all marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand this, and they were afraid to ask him about this saying. So at least in this one, they're like, that doesn't sound right. But then the third time, Jesus previews what's going to happen. And taking the 12, he said to them, "Everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon. And after flogging him, they will kill him. And on the third day, he will rise." but they understood none of these things. How do they not get that? Jesus is telling them explicitly what's going to happen, and they don't get it. It's because of their expectations. Their expectations had blinded them to what God was doing. I remember it was either 1992 or 1994. The San Francisco 49ers played the Dallas Cowboys 3 times in a row in the NFC Championship game. And one of my best friends from high school was at Cal. He was a football player, and he got the opportunity to intern with Fox Sports. And so I was up there the weekend that they were playing this game at Candlestick, and he said, "Oh, you ought to just come with me. I think I can get you on the field." I was like, okay. And so I walked into Candlestick just like I knew what I was doing with the crowd, the Fox, and I got on the field. And he was the guy that had the cords before they had all the, the cordless cameras. And eventually they see that I don't have a badge and I get kicked out. But what happened is my grandparents live in Sacramento. And so I had told them I'm going to be in the Bay Area over the weekend. I may come stop by on Sunday and spend the night there and then drive home on Monday. So I drive over to Sacramento. And I get there, and I know that it's about the time my grandparents would be heading to church for the evening service. It's a small Baptist church. They did Sunday morning, Sunday night, Sunday school, BTC, which was like Sunday school at night before the service. So they were there a lot on Sunday. And so I said, I'll start heading to the church. And as I'm heading to the church, I actually recognize my grandparents' car. And so I get behind them, and I start tailgating. And I could kind of see the uncomfortableness, my grandfather who was driving. And so then I pull around to the side, and I'm like looking right at them, and they're not going to make eye contact with this crazy guy next to him. So eventually I get in front of him, and I slow down. And it's like then I pulled to this side of him, and my grandfather looks, and now he's like pissed. And he looks at me, and he stares at me, and he just keeps driving. And I'm like... And so I follow him to church, and in the parking lot, I park next to him, and I get out of the car, and they're like, "Brandon." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's been Brandon the whole time. Like, why didn't they recognize me?" Because they weren't expecting me. I told that story first service, and so John Hutch, one of our elders, comes up to me, and he goes, "Well, I know what your grandfather was feeling like." I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah, my grandson, who I think was 8 years old at the time, came down to surprise him for his birthday from Oregon. His grandson pretended like he was selling candy at the door. And he didn't recognize him." It's like our expectations really decide how we see things. But the angels tell them, "Don't you remember what Jesus said?" And all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, we do remember that." And so the women go hustling and tell the disciples, and 2 of the disciples go to the tomb, and they see the tomb's empty, but they still don't quite believe it. And the reason we know that is because it says 2 of the disciples were walking on this road, the road to Emmaus, if you skip ahead to verse 13, chapter 24. It says, "That very day, 2 of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, 'What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?' And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered, 'Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?' And he said to them, 'What things?' And they said to him, 'Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel.'" Do you notice the words they said are the exact same words that we've read already in Luke? Like, this is what their expectations were, so different than what God did through Jesus. So different, in fact, that even after Jesus rises from the dead and people hear about it and people bear witness to, it's a stumbling block to Paul's and Peter's evangelistic efforts. All through the book of Acts, that's the one issue that constantly keeps people from accepting Jesus as the Messiah, is that he suffered and died. Luke writes Acts. It's kind of volume 2 of Luke. And look what he says. This is Peter's sermon in chapter 3. And now, brothers, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did also your rulers, but what God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, that his Christ would suffer, he is thus fulfilled. Later on in Acts 13, as Paul's preaching, brothers, sons of the family of Abraham, and those among you who fear God, to us has been sent the message of this salvation. For those who live in Jerusalem and the rulers, because they did not recognize him nor understand the utterances of the prophets, fulfilled them by condemning him. And when they had carried out all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. And that tree is a reference to Deuteronomy, where the cursed hang on a tree. But God raised him from the dead. Acts chapter 17, Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. Over and over again, the issue was, did God's Messiah, did the Christ have to suffer and die and rise again? And Paul over and over, and it continues. Paul says, the underline saying, nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer. In Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, he has to make the same case. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Now, why is this such a stumbling block? It's a stumbling block because if you just think about the movies you've seen with crucifixions, whether that's on a cross or on a stake. Why do they crucify people? Because they want to prop him up so that everybody sees that person crucified and says, if you try anything, that's what's going to happen. You better stay in line. It was the most shameful way to die in the Roman Empire. And the idea that God would actually suffer and die like that, they couldn't wrap their minds around it because that wasn't their expectations. Their expectations had blinded them. And so you have a whole group of disciples who are disappointed, and you have a whole group of religious leaders who are resentful because God did not meet their expectations. He wasn't doing what they expected to do. And yet, as Jesus and Paul went back through the Old Testament, they could point to verse after verse, passage after passage that said this was going to happen. So perhaps as Jesus is walking on Emmaus, or when he's sitting with the disciples, this is what he would say. He goes, do you remember that story in Exodus? Do you remember that story in Moses? The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you. Do you remember that 10th plague when you were in Egypt? And Pharaoh had killed all of your sons, or tried to kill your sons, and God in his justice was going to take the sons of Egypt. And the only thing that distinguished those who were going to be held to the judgment and God's curse were those who had blood painted on the doorpost. They were to sacrifice a lamb, take that blood, and paint it on the doorpost, and so now we know of it as the Passover lamb. And Jesus says, you remember that story? Blood was necessary to protect you from your sin, to keep you from suffering the consequences of your sin. Now I'm that Passover lamb. He said as much in the upper room when he broke bread, this is my body. No longer does this represent solely the haste with which you had to leave Egypt. This is now my body. This wine no longer represents just the blood of the Passover lamb. This is my blood. This was pointed to in the law of Moses. And he goes on through the prophets. Isaiah 53 speaks of a servant of the Lord, and it says, but he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. There's really not a good Jewish interpretation of this passage. And what I mean by that is there's no agreement on to who this could be. Isaiah talks about a servant of the Lord who is going to be raised up. There are some other places where it's pretty clear that it's a reference to Cyrus, the king of Persia, who allowed them to go back at one time in their history. But this particular passage, it's like, what is this? Who is this? And Jesus says, that's me. The apostles say, this is Jesus. It sounds like what Jesus did, isn't it? He had to do this in order to serve the Lord and save his people. But it wasn't just Moses, it wasn't just the prophets, it's also in the writings. Psalm is one of the writings. It says, "But I am a worm and not a man." This is a king of Israel speaking. "Scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him." Sound like what Jesus was going through at the cross? As they taunted him, "If you really are the Son of God, get off the cross. Help yourself." Their expectations weren't right. They didn't understand what God was doing, and it led to disappointment, and it led to resentment. Maybe you've experienced that you've expected God to do something. You've expected God to answer prayer in a certain way. You've expected your life to go differently, and now you're at the very least disappointed in God. Maybe you're actually resentful to God because of these expectations you had. So if we can't expect from God, what's a better way? Because I think we hear that, don't expect God. It's like, well, there's some things we can expect, aren't there? Yeah. But I think a better way to go through life on a day-to-day basis is not to expect from God, but to accept God, to accept what he's done. And eventually the disciples get there. They get to that place where they realize the way that God did it was the best way. The way that God did it demonstrated his love beyond anything and in any better way. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And so when they accept that this was God's Messiah, when they accept that he had been cursed, that he did die on the cross, that he was raised from the dead, when they accept that, the disappointment and the resentment is replaced by something else. Look at the end of chapter 24. "Then he led them out as far as Bethany," that's Jesus, "and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. And while he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple blessing God." When they accepted what God had done, the disappointment and resentment turned to worship and great joy. That's our invitation at Easter. Will we continually be disappointed and resent God because of the way life has gone? Or will we put on the lens of Easter and accept what God has done and what God is continuing to do and worship him and praise him for that? Why is that so significant on Easter? Well, let me just read you a passage from Romans that's probably familiar to you. Give you a little snapshot. Perhaps you've heard this verse, chapter 8, verse 28. "And we know that for those who love the Lord, all things work together for good." Really, God? Because there's some things that I've been expecting in my life that haven't happened. And there's some things that have happened in my life that I haven't expected. And it doesn't feel like it's for my good. And how does Paul make that argument? How can he say that with integrity and hope? Listen to what he ties it into. "What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all," Easter, "how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" Because of Easter, we can accept anything that God brings into our path. And we can do it with worship, and we can do it with hope, and we can do it with joy. Sometimes God will graciously show us today how this is somehow contributing to our good, how somehow this is a loving thing that he's bringing into our life. Sometimes we'll have to wait weeks. Sometimes we'll have to wait months. Sometimes we'll have to wait years. Sometimes we won't even find out in this life. But we can always look back to Easter and see the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of creation. the death of God, resulted in the greatest good. It was the most loving thing that God could do. And whenever we doubt that, whenever our expectations start getting cloudy and we start thinking, God, you're here for me. God, help me be successful. God, help this to happen. And it doesn't happen, rather than getting bitter and disappointed and resentful, go back to Easter. And remember that God loved us so much that he was willing to die for us. It's still the stumbling block that gets in the way for people today. Jewish people, their biggest issue is that God would die on a cross. Muslims, their biggest issue is that God would die on a cross. The cross is a stumbling block. It's not what we expected. But if we accept it, we're saved. We have salvation. And so if you're here this morning and you believe that, you know that you're a child of God. And my prayer is that you would begin to accept the life that God has granted you. And whether that life is, quote, the good life or a life of struggle, that you would learn to depend on him and trust that it's what he has for you, and you would remember the love that he showed us on Easter and the good that came out of that. If you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus, that you haven't experienced that salvation, this idea might be the first time you've even heard why Jesus died on a cross. My prayer is that this morning you'd realize the resurrection of Jesus helps us, forces us to accept that what God has for us is better than anything we could expect. For that, we give him thanks this morning. Let's pray.